Yeah, you're quite welcome. Thanks, Catherine and Morgan. All right, so this is great, nice turnout. I've always thought these are the kinds of situations where you learn the most at graduate school. And you also get nutrition and so forth. But we should have plenty of time for some real lively interchange. I have some remarks that come off of this platform. Not maybe quite everybody has one, but maybe we can share. So it's a real pleasure to come down here. I actually never been to USC campus before, and I don't think I've been to Los Angeles for like 15 years. TFA has kind of been here, and I'm sure I'll be back now all the time. This is actually the second anniversary of my beginning this role at Teach for America. And it took pretty much that whole time to get this kind of position to do this kind of talk. So I'm going to start, have this agenda. It's the second slide, and there's a bit of introductory material. Catherine laid out some of the elements, but I want to unpack some of that because kind of me and what my particular perspective and experience matters in terms of what Teach for America thinks about external research and the kinds of partnerships that might lead to. We have to talk a little bit about the relevant history. There's just a bunch of history that matters in terms of this topic. And then this is a sort of stepping stone for some recent development that also have some bearing. And then the heart of the talk is really walking through an agenda, which is got 6 elements to it, talking about why that matters to us and how it might matter to folks in academia. And then at the end, I'll talk a bit about some of the logistical things that go along with potential partnerships, and that'd be then the launch point for some discussion. So, by way of introductions, let's say I was in a traditional teacher program, but it's a little different. Right? When I say that, you have to keep in mind that the teachers I had in that program included it's basically an all-star cast of the National Academy of Education. So this means Lee Shulman and Nell Noddings, Robert Calfee, Elizabeth Cohen, the teaching fellows or the doctoral students involved were people like Steve Athanasius, now I think at Davis, and Ron Glass at Santa Cruz. So this is a really pretty special faculty for a teacher education program, a traditional one. And on top of that, what does this mean, traditional? I was teaching 2 classes in a local high school. I was the teacher of record and paid for that work. And this was back in the late 80s, and math was a shortage subject, so I could sort of get that kind of a gig for my practical component of a traditional program. But that is pretty much exactly what people will now call an alternative program, because it is not like on September 4th, I had like all my wits about me in terms of what on earth was happening in the classroom. I guess there was a case I'd do more good than harm. I don't know who really studied that question either. Stanford was kind of selective, but there was no data on anything back then. So I have that perspective on what we mean when we say alternative and traditional programs. And then I did some kind of with the program work. I got involved in National Board Teacher Certification as an applicant and a certified teacher, and then a scorer, because I thought it was super interesting. And Lee Shulman planted the seed when I was in my teacher program that this was sort of a neat, important thing. It made sense for other reasons. I also got involved in the teachers union, wound up running the teachers union in a local district in Northern California because I thought, where the hell is all this money going? Let's understand a bit more about that. And I got drawn out into some of the bigger questions about money and how the districts work and policy, and that led to basically becoming a researcher and the work I've done since being a classroom teacher. And there's a lot of it. Right? I've been out there a while, so I just have a bunch of perspectives on this role. And then, it's not possible for me to provide sort of a common platform of basic knowledge about TFA for us to have a conversation based on. Partly just doing that is basically starts arguments. So I've learned we won't even try to do that. But you probably know a bunch, and you know lots of different things about TFA. So that's so worth mentioning. I will not get into Teach for All, although it is a fascinating subject, and I'm engaged with Teach for All staff and think there's a bunch of research interests there too. We've actually hired someone to sort of manage the research portfolio over there, but I don't speak for them at all. And then we'll move into the history piece. So, the forces that you could call shaped Teach for America's past disposition towards external research. There are a few I've highlighted here. First, Teach for America had to raise a lot of money on an annual basis. It needed to be able to make a case with funders, public and private, and it needed to do that, going way back to when there really wasn't lots of other evidence around. It had to be proactive to try to stir up evidence. And this meant, it was actually getting some research together that was pretty high caliber, and others weren't necessarily doing that. It was hard to do and expensive, but it still was the case that as little as possible investment towards that made a lot of sense, and the investments were automatically kind of self-serving. It wasn't somehow we were like looking for common ground and trying to dig in on questions that matter from a building knowledge perspective. So its initial engagement in the field of external research was not the way it is I intend to be. It bears mentioning that Teach for America endured a ton of criticism early on that smacks of a double standard. It is not like we're kind of out of the woods on that either. But it matters, I think, that the kind of crucible in which the organization was formed really had a lot of that flavor to it. And there was some very vitriolic rhetoric, and there, of course, was no evidence really to speak of. And that, that kind of carried over into the way the organization dealt with researchers and the research community in basically unfortunate ways. Teach for America, from the beginning, was pretty serious about continuous improvement and really refining the way it does some essential business practices. So the business of recruiting and selecting teachers, this is kind of the heart of the matter, is something they've done with a ton of energy on continuous improvement. And some of that actually gets documented. I'll say more about it later. But what it also does is create sort of the basis for a national brand and proprietary information. And once you have those things in place, it makes it a different conversation in terms of getting data to people to sort of just run with it and create studies. You have your sort of business purposes that might conflict in a lot of cases with your with the goals of researchers. So it becomes a little harder to sort of find the common ground. And the last thing is the Teach for America, it's fair to say, pretty aggressively privileged specific positive findings in its communications about what the research says. And I've tried to sort of pull us back a bit in that sense. It's not like it's the only organization you could accuse of cherry picking, right? But it was doing it, and it really matters that that it's conscious of that and be kind of held to a higher standard. And I'll say why in a bit. Now, there's been some recent developments, and I mean like within the past just couple of years, that really matter. So one is we created an external explicit research agenda. This implicit agenda to sort of have evidence to take to funders no longer is going to cut it. We really have to sort of proactively form partnerships, pursue questions that mean something to the organization and researchers. A funder thought we needed to do that, for one thing, and so this was actually a charge I had when I came in as part of a grant. And it was one of the most exciting things about the role, I mean, honestly, when I was pursuing the role. So I've worked on that, and we'll go through it. We've also devolved a bunch of autonomy to regions. That is still pretty much a brand new story. And exactly what that means is not quite set in stone. But it's exciting. It means there's a lot of sort of change management stuff going on internally. There's still some kind of non-negotiable stuff about what it means to be a Teach for America region, but there's a lot of other stuff that's kind of fair game. And it means that there's sort of a new, really legitimate question about differences between regions. We've always been pretty hesitant to sort of pit regions against one another in research framings. But now there's, I think you almost have to go there in some ways. Teach for America also has spread its wings on policy matters in ways you could really not have imagined if you had been paying attention 5 years ago. For example, it came out in favor of the DREAM Act, and now I think there are about 50 core members who are teaching under Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status. And this is a big deal. It's not like there's a lot of other teacher preparation outfits because they require massive subsidies. Most of these are people that grew up in poverty, and they're part of that scene. So we're not just saying we support policy, but really doing something in that space. And then similarly, we came out in favor of Common Core, kind of after everybody else in the world did. But that was what you have to say, a little bit distant from the main business of Teach for America with respect to policy, which is always kind of focused on, being able to get people in the classroom at the state level, and when it comes down to it, a few funding issues and a highly qualified teacher provision at the federal level. The communications, the organization issues and hosts on its website have become, in some noticeable ways, a little more science-based. I mean, I'm proud of some things I've really pushed on to sharpen that up. I'll give you an example. The states that rank teacher prep programs, of course, are producing very noisy rankings, right? And so most people basically hate them. The literature about this stuff is not really kind. But the states that go through the trouble do want to call attention to the work. Teach for America likes to call attention to the work too, because it looks really good on these rankings. But you have to sort of acknowledge that from a social science research perspective, they're problematic. So we're now really trying to lead with the idea that consistency from year to year is kind of the top point. But that has to mean something. If you're consistently from year to year at the, at or near the top of these rankings, it means more than anything else you could say about the rankings. And so I've pushed on that, and there's other things too. We resolved and then really did start listening carefully to critics. And one of the reasons is a lot of critics these days are alumni of the organization or staff. And so you just have to listen in a different way. And we've done that and processed it, and I think there's ways of pointing to it making a difference. We've also responded in new ways to just some complete rubbish that winds up out there about us. And an example of that is there's a blog called Pass the Chalk. This is sort of the TFA's official blog. And if you go up to last January, I posted a few items. I think that would still be called the most caustic things ever posted on that blog. And I was responding to some specific rubbish that people had written about Teach for America. And this is just not the kind of response the organization ever would have mounted before. It's kind of my strong suit, so I'm happy to do it. I was in a think tank for 4 years, wrote a lot of very public stuff, did some actual takedown pieces of horrible Heritage Foundation studies, and I love bringing those kinds of skills to bear. And the organization, at least occasionally, lets me off the leash for that kind of work. Then, this is the biggest deal here. The organization has officially dropped its famous agnosticism about whether more than 2 years of teaching is a good thing. It is now officially a good thing. The organization is investing in really making it more feasible to the extent that it has any power over the question for people that finish the commitment to stay in teaching. You have to be really explicitly on the fence about whether people stayed or not, and if it thought that was good because it had a two-pronged theory of action and so forth. It's just not the case anymore. The full implications of that haven't really percolated, I would say, into the landscape. But it matters, and it's not, we're not going back on that.
So you guys are changing policies to accomplish that?
The commitment is still 2 years.
Okay.
And it's liable to remain that way for a bunch of reasons based on data. But the idea that the organization can't somehow come out as very pro additional teaching is gone. So we're now actually investing. We have a pilot to explore specific, actually it's a series of pilots, I think in about a dozen regions, to explore specific ways to support alumni past the commitment in their third, fourth, and fifth year that really want to stay teaching. You know, what can we possibly help them stay in the field? I mean, I'll stay out of policy mostly here. I think that it's not really within our control to have people stay in teaching, but it certainly is different to say we honor and value additional teaching beyond 2 years than to be basically on the fence about it, which we had been. And you remind me, Morgan, too, I'm perfectly happy sort of with clarifying questions that are really burning as we go along. I've worked with enough economists to be really used to that kind of halting progress through talks. But it is best, of course, if we can wait. Now, so I've done the recent developments. Now let's start into this agenda piece. So we've got an agenda. Agenda is probably the wrong word, really, but there's 6 framing assertions, or you can call them meta stories. And these aren't like articulated down to the question level, but they're overlapping. Within them, there's tons of questions. There have to be tons of questions of interest to the scholars, people in academia, and to the organization. And somehow or other, there's got to be way more common ground than has ever been properly explored. And then a lot of things are kind of new. I mean, basically new stuff, like I talked about the DACA core members. I mean, there's some stuff that's new there to study. So I'll walk you through these 6 pieces and sort of say, why we have these. So first, it's a continuously growing organization. So, there's a lot of questions about specifically what that looks like. I don't think, anybody necessarily wants to glorify Teach for America by sort of adding to that literature, but there's some really interesting work to do there. The stuff that exists, by and large, is sort of an offshoot of consulting engagements, like where Teach for America goes out and gets a Wharton professor or someone, a team of them, to sort of figure out how to optimize some real clever matching scheme. And they like to do it because it's interesting. They get set up an arrangement where they'll be able to publish a paper based off of that, so it suits their academic purposes. The organization gets their expertise and a new algorithm that sort of does something better. So continuous improvement literature is what I would call papers that come off of that. And sort of launching into that kind of thing won't happen right away, but if you're interested in that kind of space, there's, I think, some really, really interesting work. And this means publishing discrete math papers. They're like pretty wonky stuff. But not only. I think there's actually still some room in the world for collections of case studies around continuous improvement, which are a little more accessible. And the second assertion here is that Teach for America provides a lens on the importance of selectivity. So, we just think that being selective about who goes into teaching is important to do. And we're not the only ones. But we certainly thought real hard about what you do if that's what you care about. There's more to do in terms of bringing the thought process and the mechanics of that into the public realm. I think there's a lot of literatures too where if you start wondering whether you want to be selective about people going into other kinds of public service, things that Teach for America has done might be of some interest. So I think there's some room for people to explore selectivity on its own right, for its own merit, and then it overlaps with some of these other things we'll talk about. So this next assertion is a neat one to me. Core members and alumni bend the opportunity curve for low-income children directly and indirectly. So, in a lot of ways, you could think of this as sort of an umbrella idea encapsulating the traditional marginal impact studies. So, the question of whether core members are more effective on average than the other teachers teaching the same subjects in the same schools that students would be able to get. And there's a lot of that stuff out there. There's going to be more. But it is not probably the most interesting kind of stuff to ask. And I think we'd be all way better off if, even if those studies have to happen, because let's say they're the kernel of some kind of grant, the state or some other outfit throws our way, you can do work on top of that. That probably is enlightening. So get other outcomes onto the table. And really start looking for sort of what I would call exotic effects, like sort of spillover and other kinds of things that you might, of course, you might not expect to find much because all these effects are small in the first place. But just the sort of act of looking, I think, is kind of interesting. It allows you to write in a different way. There's already a working paper out there that AIR, the Calder group, posted, and there's sort of some final versions with more data coming soon on that, where they're exploring the spillover effect. But I think more of that kind of thing would be great. I mean, I personally find the marginal impact studies pretty boring. Like in terms of, we basically know what on average you're going to find. There's a pretty strong consensus there. Then the next one, so they're meant to sort of build up and be more and more surprising and interesting here, at least in this setting. Core members, alumni, and staff show fidelity to the mission, Teach for America's mission to eliminate educational inequity and patterns of service among institutions serving low-income children. So what this is about is trying to create a more of a broader frame for the very traditional question about whether core members stay in their original placement schools more than 2 years. So, the agencies that hire core members should knock themselves out creating reports. They sort of have these little cascade reports that show the percentage of core members that stay in the placement schools year 2, year 3, and so forth. And that's their business because they're the hiring agencies. From our perspective, that doesn't tell the whole story. And usually kind of actually it's fair to say that story is the bane of our existence in the public affairs space, because basically the core members are not staying at the same rates in the placement schools as other new teachers in these agencies. And by how much and so forth all varies. And there's not even a ton of really good work of that kind. But there's just got to be way more interesting other questions to ask that sort of fit under this umbrella. And I think that's, it's the case not just from making the world safer for Teach for America, but I think in terms of figuring out what it's going to take to get high quality people working with low-income kids, and not just in schools. These kind of questions about public service are very broad. We, as a country, sort of an aversion to funding public service. I mean, I live in a Western state, so I feel very confident on that assertion. And and saw as a kid the sort of California's own divestment from public services. And so, I think Teach for America would like to partner in sort of pursuing this. And then the next element here is that core members and alumni pursue ambitious opportunities to lead at scale. So now this ties directly to one of the things Teach for America is about, which is recruiting people explicitly for their interest in taking on really audacious kinds of jobs. And being a classroom teacher is one of them, and that is the initial one as a core member. And we've always been really, proud of the fact that people go on to take on all kinds of other audacious jobs. And now we're even a little bit less bashful about the fact that they can just stay in classrooms as teacher leaders and so forth. And that actually is very, very important work. But work to really kind of unpack this is, I think, not really adequately explored. I think there's some work leveraging longitudinal methods, really doing some very clever coding of the kinds of roles that people have. And we have, so this is where we have this really pretty intense data where we might be able to crack into the things in some enlightening ways. And then I will move now to the last piece, which is, you may have seen a blog I did a few weeks ago on Rick Hessen's thing. I kind of spoke to this a little bit, but it is surely the fact that in identity and practice, core members, alumni, and staff embody the notion that diversity among those serving low-income children matters. The organization has really wrestled very hard with questions around diversity in recent years and becoming, more consciously a social equality-oriented organization. Beyond its mission statement, but really thinking about that and how it relates to the identity of its staff and core members and its investments in recruiting a diverse core all matter. There's not a lot of research in this space. There's a little bit, but not that much. I think this is, to me, a really ripe terrain for some new partnerships that are kind of right over the plate in terms of what is the traditional strong suit for people based in schools of education. And the reason I say that is if you start asking, what is the research base for sort of the idea that, gosh, we want a teacher workforce that sort of reflects a little better the student body in terms of background. You come into some basically a dearth of good evidence. There's a few papers, and most of it's a little icky to talk about. You get in trouble pretty fast even talking about it. And I just think that there's got to be some really exciting work to do of this kind. Most of it is going to be qualitative. Some of it can be kind of neat and quantitative. And Teach for America just seems like we ought to make our interest in that kind of work well understood, because the core itself these days, the new core starting here in the field now is half teachers of color. A large percentage, I think 47%, with a low-income background. And this kind of diversity doesn't happen by accident in teacher preparation programs. A lot of programs really try to get a diverse group in, and it's tough. So we've invested in that. We've been pretty successful. It matters to us. I think it matters to the communities we serve. We think it matters a lot to people in schools of education that we traditionally haven't had a lot of partnership with around building knowledge in the social science literatures. So, and we'll never have those partnerships if you don't know that we're interested in partnering and developing work there. So I'll say some things now about sort of the infrastructure a little bit, like the data that can be brought to bear in doing this work. So, there actually is a lot of really exciting data that Teach for America can bring into the fold. A lot of it is what generated kind of by the continuum. So we have this pipeline of people coming in as recruits, and then they apply, and then they're maybe admitted, and they may matriculate, and all the way along there is a survey, or more than one, and this just generates data, and then they're in the core, and then there are surveys and surveys, and then there are alumni and there are surveys. And so all that data can be mapped to a unique core member identifier, and there's got to be lots of interesting stuff you can do just with that. There's also other data sources within the organization that's sort of outside the program. And I have to say that it's really difficult to get additional questions folded into the surveys that we administer for several reasons. So I can almost say we won't even try that because it's just a very difficult place to go. The idea of news surveys is tough. Often it's the only way you can go after certain kinds of data. but it's a tough one. The sort of the saturation question of in the space. And then what's easy is actually just lighting up core members in an agency data set. And we can provide them with a data set that allows them to light up core members, and then that can go to a third-party researcher, and they can be off and running doing lots of work. Now that's the kind of work we don't necessarily need tons more of, like the marginal impact studies. But then, that also can be, as I said, kind of the baseline or the platform for lots of other inquiry. Qualitative work, everybody.
Oh, I agree.
Is also really important. I think we can go there. Interviews, ethnography, and that kind of stuff. That's always hard. I mean, that's just not just us. That's just the field and what happens out in schools and communities. But we're really interested in entertaining that kind of idea. And then it's the only way to get into stuff. So we have to go there. And we have a bunch of projects in that realm. I mean, we're not just all about Mathematica studies. There are actually about 60 partnerships in the pipeline right now, some of which feature qualitative methods, where we really have brought our resources to bear and getting them supported.
Raegan? Can
Yep.
I ask you a question about the survey data that you have? Are these comprehensive surveys? Are there like lists of constructs available somewhere or something? Is that something that you could share? I mean, if folks wanted to know like what was on these surveys?
It's something we can explore together as we sort of go down the road of a potential partnership. It takes work, basically, to have the conversations, and it's a big organization. My team has actually taken on a role of what we call trying to create a more coherent governance around data within the organization. We're not the only organization where the functional teams are kind of siloed and they have their own little cultures. And that means they have their own theory about what kind of code book they should have that pertains to their data. So it's kind of a messy question, but the answer is certainly if there's a good idea for a research study, we will try to go down the road of figuring out what data can be brought to bear. There's just scads of it now.
Thanks.
So, I want to just finish by like the process, right? Like, let's say if someone wants to get involved in a partnership, what that means is we have to start talking about what your idea is. So you can email me, or you can get my address quite easily from Noel, and then or this address here, which will sort of launch a Salesforce thing, and I'll get back to you. I'm of the mind that there's no shortage of money for especially supporting good ideas. There's a shortage of good proposals. I'm really always interested in trying to help people, craft good proposals and then push them through. Here, and the ability for me to push them through means, there's some buy-in I'll have to get sometimes from the data-owning teams or the organization. That the extent of buy-in that I have to generate will vary based on the nature of the project. Now, because we have an explicit agenda, one of the questions is, how much is this over the plate with respect to our agenda? You saw the agenda is, you could say, pretty ecumenical. I mean, there's a room there for an awful lot of things. And then feasibility, which has to do with like specific data concerns, and then there's just the amount of bandwidth and internal capacity that needs to be involved. And it's often not easy to sort of figure it out, but the conversations are the starting place. And I mentioned the business of funding. I'm really keen to try to bring funding to the table when there's ideas that merit it. Our development shop is kind of a finally owned outfit, and we can try to bring research to funding to research when it's something that's aligned with our agenda and makes sense to a specific funder. And I'm happy to approach development about that. Some work is expensive, and we need to buy out people's time or pay for or something. And then the other processes are kind of familiar, but, there's legal agreements around data sharing and the access, and then there's partnership, and then the one thing, and there's a lot of misperceptions around this, I think, in the research world, is that, Teach for America, as part of partnership agreement, does need to see products before they go public. This means being able to see them, review them, supply comments about, like, let's say, descriptions of the program and so forth, because, we have an interest in these being correct, and feel like probably we're the best judge of some basic stuff. This is different than somehow shaping the findings, right? We actually have some expertise in research areas, can provide useful comments. Just a few minutes ago, I was asked to review a proposal by a foundation because I know stuff about reviewing research proposals. So I don't like withholding that kind of expertise from people that have done their best to square away a paper. But editorial control still lies with researchers. So I wanted to just say that so everybody understands. There's a reasonable basis, and I won't go into detail, but there's a reasonable basis for kind of imagining maybe there was some other story involved there. But that is the way it works these days. So that's the extent of my remarks. And there's a lot in them. Some of it maybe a little provocative, probably a lot of it a little surprising. And then, this provides the basis for some great questions. And what I'll do, I think Catherine probably knows almost everybody's name. Maybe there's new people, beginning of a term and everything, so you have a pass in some ways, but more than I.
True.
So why don't you sort of field the questions, and then we were trying to capture this on video, so I'll do my best to sort of repeat questions to get that onto the tape. So let's start into that.
Great. Does anyone have a question for Raegan? Yeah.
So, I've read some interesting pieces about Teach for America recently. I don't think it was through Teach for America, but the whole idea of your older core members having greater retention. That was a really interesting piece. So I'm wondering, with some of the new research agenda and some of the findings, have you changed any of your messaging or marketing or recruiting in any way based on this new research agenda?
Well, so the agenda hasn't really been in place long enough to develop new knowledge that helps us sort of pivot on things. But the organization has always done a ton of internal research that sort of guides, and what I would say is internal research I sort of put under the rubric of how do you place your bets, right? So the standards for evidence are different, and a lot of the work is sort of, you could say, done in the ilk of business consulting as opposed to the social science research. But there are some key things that, whether it's now even external work out there, that sort of speak directly to some of the ideas in the agenda that matter, I'd say. So the example I'd give is a piece that Jason Irizarry, I think, the name's eluding me, and Morgan Donaldson did a piece where they looked at maybe if there was differences in motivations between different kind of core members in terms of backgrounds, and then relating that to their behavior in terms of retention. And it did seem like that in their findings, Latino core members were coming into the work with a kind of give back to the communities and the school systems that in a lot of cases kind of failed them. They weren't as good as they should have been. And that motivation seems to be part of their whole impetus for going into teaching. And this is the kind of thing we'd like to see way more work on. Another sort of way that breaks too is that a huge percentage of the core, I think it's about 30%, is people with other kinds of professional experience as opposed to coming right out of college. And their behavior is, you can bet, going to be systematically different. And one of the bases is that, and it matters in terms of the way we do business, is they tend to want to take core positions in the place they live already, as opposed to packing up and moving to across the country. So I think that's an important thing, so with a huge percentage of teachers at large, and not just ours, I think it's like 45% or something these days. Will Marinell did probably some good work on this. There's more to learn. Teach for America, a good lens on it. So that's an answer. Good question. Mike?
John, did you?
Sorry,
No.
John.
No worries. So you're probably familiar with Morgan and Andrew Porter's work on the MET study and
Yeah.
value-added models, and states like North Carolina, Tennessee, and others that have used that and attached it to the value of the teacher ed programs. To what extent has your organization been affected by those kinds of models in terms of the core members that are in those states, and how do you look at that data or consider it at all in terms of your own research agenda? Is TFA, as a side question to that, is TFA looking to develop a similar research model or some form of model around teacher achievement or teacher effectiveness?
Yeah, well, I mean, the primary way that evidence plays is that it's evidence that's got a local flavor that we can use for making our case. And we're fortunate that we tend to look good. I would say, as I already did, that these schemes to use value-added estimates, have some shortcomings.
Right.
And a lot of people are willing to kind of go a little too far in saying what that means.
Absolutely.
In terms of the use of public dollars and so forth. So we, as I said, want people to get other outcomes on the table, start pursuing sort of other kinds of stuff, like really looking at interaction among teachers in schools, including core members and others, and that's the kind of research I think that would be really enlightening. And I think for states to invest and support research. To shed some light on the caliber of their licensed institutions makes some sense. But our agenda, I think, also shows that there's other priorities that we have and that others should also have.
Okay, so in terms of, for example, if like Deborah Ball's and Raegan Lampert's work around interactions that support learning as an alternative to some of the student achievement gains as connected to what happens in the actual classroom versus, and one of the critiques of the value-added model being that you're just looking solely at achievement gains rather than what's happening in the, or the context of the classroom which the teacher gets in the beginning of the school year. And the demographics of the classroom as it relates to those achievement gains. So I'm wondering, is TFA interested or is developing a similar agenda around looking at what their teachers do in the classroom as it relates to those achievement gains?
Yeah, well, so I mean, the internal research is a different story.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, there's some overlap between what we'll do internally and the external research agenda. Internally, this involves lots of work that's based on student achievement, but lots of other work where we have data involving the observations that the MTLDs, who are sort of the coaches out in the field, do, and we try to leverage that data to sort of refine how we approach that work. And the fact that there's some pretty exciting variation now across regions and how people can elaborate that work is, I think somehow or other there's got to be ways of learning and building knowledge in the external space for that. It doesn't come right out on the surface of the external research agenda. And part of the reason is a lot of that data is very difficult to bring into external partnerships. There are employment agreements that kind of bind us from not sharing certain things. Like the MTLDs are insights as coaches, and you can't necessarily just port their observation information into a study willy-nilly. And there's a lot of other ground for us to cover.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
I have a brief question.
yes.
Just
where you talk about an internal research agenda versus, do you have a list, like, on the website or somewhere that people would then see what the internal agenda is, so that it's not necessarily overlapping with, right, because you said some of it's gonna overlap, but I imagine that you're less likely to take on a study from an external researcher if it's something that already is happening internally,
Well,
where the
There's not a
priorities are totally
list.
different.
but what you can bet is that any of the program teams is working mightily to figure out how to refine its efforts. And it's got tons of data and does a lot of analysis. And their agenda is, it's not public, and it's as I said earlier, they're kind of on a rapid development cycle, and they're trying to sort of make the best guesses they can about how to tweak things, because there's resource constraints, and they've got the sort of cycle of, okay, we've got new core members showing up, what are we going to do differently? The pace of research in social science is a little different. It's sort of a slower kind of proposition.
So I think following up on Steph's question, and I think John's too, it's still a little, so I know one of your goals in coming here was to sort of start a discussion around how you could collaborate with researchers at USC or beyond in exploring some of the kind of ideas that you put forth in your 6 research agenda items. But I think it's still a little bit vague for people as to how they would go about doing that. So it's hard to kind of come to you with an idea without knowing what the data are inside the organization that can be kind of used. And so you've got a list of sort of, you've got administrative data, but I mean, like, I also know you have sort of selection data, that you have a lot of that, or that just from our own, I'm sure everyone has their own knowledge of TFA, and they know someone who's a core member who told them, oh yeah, I filled out this survey and I had to answer this question. So could you give us a little more detail around the specific kinds of data that you have that could be shared without being, really trampling on someone internal's toes?
Yeah, this is a big story. They're starting with on the kind of front end of the continuum. There's extremely detailed selection information. There's actually been some publications that leverage that data. One looking at the relationship between some of our selection measures, which are kind of composites of other things, and value-added estimates, and then a kind of a duplication of that effort, and then also tied in principal performance evaluations, and looking at kind of basically just correlations, and you could call that sort of validation kind of work. Looking at that is enlightening in terms of knowing where we can go in terms of using selection data. It's really not possible for us to unpack that data beyond the level that it appears in those publications. So there's certain bins, those things are described in certain ways publicly, and that's it. And the reason is that when we have this huge operation involving tens of thousands of applicants, we can't have too much information out there about these measures, or people could kind of pollute, contaminate the process. And that's the feeling of the team that owns the process, and so it's kind of governed where we can go. But I think there's still terrain to explore in terms of how those measures relate to other things of concern in some of those bins. And then as people move through the continuum, there are surveys that ask lots of questions, and they ask questions to do with people's experience. What was your experience like in ways that might matter in terms of your efficacy, your likelihood to stay in the classroom longer than 2 years? And there's all kinds of ways that theoretically that stuff can be tied to questions. But it's, as I said, kind of like scads of information, and not really something I can provide a handy guide to. It'd be nice, right? But that wasn't my first order of business. So I'm on the case still, Catherine. And then you move through, and then the things sort of shift with the alumni, because then these core members aren't our employees, right? They by and large complete the surveys they're asked to complete. They're selected for their propensity perhaps to even do that kind of thing, right? But once they're alumni, it's a little bit different, and we don't get everybody to chime in, but we do survey annually and ask quite a bit of the alumni in terms of responses, and then we do that every year, and have done for quite a bit, and that provides especially information about sort of career trajectory kind of stuff, and that's hardly really been mined for the purposes of building knowledge about what people with certain kinds of traits tend to do who are interested in this mission. We'd like to see it done. I think it really matters. It's probably also important for others. So, sorry with the kind of unsatisfactory answer in a lot of ways. So, but.
I have like 10 questions for Raegan, but I gotta go to lunch with him after. So if anyone else has questions. Yeah, Aisha.
Hi, Raegan. Thanks so much for your talk. I was just curious about how, in looking through your research agenda points and trying to get a specific understanding of like where is this research on looking at like the support that you're providing for teachers who kind of enter into these new roles to Teach for America, whether it's professional development or team-based structures. Are you doing any research on like, is that I don't even know if that's in your internal research agenda or external, but about like ways that you can support teachers to then be successful once they're into it as part of this new research agenda that you're pursuing?
Yeah, so let me say there's some internal work that actually will have an external facing product eventually, because some funders make the funds available that way, and it's right over the in this area in terms of like what technology makes a difference, and there are some kind of neat ideas out there. What it's safe to say though is at the moment, in terms of like what we know, there is really not much to say in terms of whether it's somehow something about our training and support that makes a difference in terms of the marginal impact estimates that often appear. What the last Mathematica study that IES funded said was, it's sort of like all signs are pointing to selection as kind of the driver of that, but it doesn't mean it really is, and it doesn't mean it in old data it's the case either. I mean, new things are happening, and I think there's, in the field, some real live questions about how, a school district who has their own support infrastructure for new teachers, some kind of, soft, what is it called usually? Induction program. California sort of elaborated better than most states scheme for that. How does that sort of interface with what Teach for America offers? We don't have anything about that. I think it's possible to study it, and it fits in the agenda.
Anyone else? I think there's one more I'm hearing. Or no more. Okay, great. Okay.
So there's been a lot of research lately from different organizations or different researchers that tries to pinpoint those 5 things that teachers need to be able to do, those 20 things that successful teachers need to do. And they're dealing with either their alumni or their student teachers, which really isn't a very good sample because you can't get your alumni to respond and your student teachers are still student teachers. So, all these inherent things, but you have people teaching in the field in that position, and I'm wondering if there's anything on your agenda, is that included in anything here, where you're trying to identify the kinds of exact skills, or you talked about the selection process, but are you looking at, the 10 things that teachers need to be able to do, if that's even possible? I question that, but it seems like a lot of people are putting a lot of energy that way.
That's a good question. So there was some work called Teaching is Leadership. Does anybody remember the title? But Stephen Farr and Wendy wrote a book about this. And this basically was a product of a whole bunch of qualitative inquiry into try to figuring out what was it about the core members that we as an organization saw really excelling. I mean, the top kinds of impact. And they distilled that into some measures, and there's rubrics, and it's used in the field. It's pretty interesting work. I think there's sort of some iterations or some ongoing work to refine that. That would also wind up with some external facing version. So that kind of work is going on. But I agree with you that the effort to sort of distill like the key traits that you need to either select for or induce somehow in teachers is a little bit of a fool's errand because it's really, really complicated work. And most of all, in my mind, it kind of ignores the fact that interaction among teachers probably matters way more than we give it credit for. And if your starting point is kind of putting that aside, I think it's a bit of a mistake. So, I mean, it's still, like, there's new knowledge that can be developed in that line, but it's hard work to do.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate it. Thank you very much.